Hey there. Tonight we're not traveling to castles or kings, but to something far more ancient. We're heading to the banks of the Nile, where the sun blazes mercilessly overhead and life moves to the rhythm of flood and drought. This is daily life in ancient Egypt, not the pharaohs or the pyramids you've heard about, but the ordinary people. The farmers and fishermen, the bread bakers and beer brewers, the ones who built civilization one mud brick at a time, who survived in a land where the desert wanted to swallow everything, and where the river was both blessing and master. If this kind of slow, meandering history helps you unwind, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always strangely comforting to see who's out there falling asleep to the same quiet story. So settle in, maybe adjust your pillow, and let's begin at the edge of the known world, where the desert meets the river, and where people learn to live in harmony with forces far greater than themselves. The village doesn't have a name that anyone remembers. It sits along a bend in the Nile, where the water moves slowly enough for fishing nets, and the mud is rich enough for growing things. The houses are low and brown, built from the same earth they farm, baked under the same sun that rises every morning like clockwork. You can see the whole settlement from the roof of any building. Maybe 40 families, their lives measured not in years, but in floods. You wake before dawn, because that's when the air is coolest and the work is bearable. The sun hasn't yet begun its daily march across the sky, and there's a gentleness to the world that will be burned away within hours. Your house is small and simple. Mud brick walls, a roof of palm fronds and reeds, a floor of packed earth that stays surprisingly cool even when the desert wind is howling outside. Water is everything here. Not just for drinking, though that's precious enough, but for the fields, for washing, for making the mud that builds your walls and the clay that holds your grain. The Nile is your calendar, your clock, your god. When it floods, you wait. When it recedes, you plant. When it runs low, you worry. The rhythm of the river is the rhythm of your life, and you've never known anything else. Your day begins with bread, because everything begins with bread. The grain was ground yesterday, the dough mixed and left to rise overnight. Now you shape it into flat rounds and place them on heated stones near the fire. The smell fills the small room, mixing with the smoke that never quite clears from the rafters. Bread is life here. Not a figure of speech, but literal truth. When the harvest fails, people die. When the grain stores run low, families make choices no one should have to make. The fields call early. Before the sun climbs high enough to make the work unbearable, you need to be out there with your tools and your animals, coaxing food from the earth. The irrigation channels need clearing. They always need clearing. Sand and silt and the occasional dead fish clog the narrow waterways that carry life from the river to your crops. You dig with wooden tools, your hands already rough from years of this work, the mud black and rich under your fingernails. Barley and emmer wheat are your main crops, hardy grains that can survive in this climate if they get enough water at the right time. You also grow onions and garlic, leeks and lettuce, and if you're lucky, a few date palms that provide fruit and shade. The work is endless and repetitive. Planting, weeding, watering, harvesting. The same tasks your father did, and his father before him, stretching back through generations of people who understood that survival meant partnership with the river. Your animals are part of the family. A few goats for milk and meat, chickens for eggs, maybe a donkey for carrying heavy loads. If you're prosperous, you might own a cow or two. They live close to the house, sometimes inside during sandstorms or when predators are prowling. You know each animal individually, their temperaments and habits, because losing even one could mean the difference between a comfortable season and a hungry one. The heat builds as morning turns to afternoon. By midday, the sun is a tyrant that drives everyone indoors or into whatever shade they can find. This is when you rest, when you repair tools or weave baskets, or tend to the 100 small tasks that keep a household running. The children play quiet games in the shadows. The adults doze or work on projects that don't require being under the open sky. Food is simple but nourishing. Bread, of course, with every meal. Beer, which is safer to drink than water and provides nutrition as well as mild intoxication. Vegetables from your garden, fish from the river when you can catch them, meat when an animal is slaughtered or when someone has been successful hunting birds in the marshes. Honey is a luxury, obtained from wild bees or traded from someone brave enough to tend hives. You eat sitting on the floor, using your hands or simple wooden utensils. Plates are made of clay, cups of the same material, or sometimes carved from wood. Nothing is wasted. Scraps go to the animals. Bones are boiled for soup. Even ash from the fire has uses in making soap or preserving food. Abundance is rare and temporary. Thrift is survival. The afternoon work is different from the morning. Less strenuous, more suited to the heat. Women often work together, grinding grain or spinning flax into thread. Men might be making repairs to houses or tools, or planning the next day's irrigation work. Children help with whatever tasks their small hands can manage. Everyone contributes because everyone must. Community matters here in ways that are hard to imagine in our modern world. When the flood comes early or late, when someone falls sick, when a family faces disaster, the village responds as one organism. Not out of sentiment, but out of necessity. Today's helper is tomorrow's helped. The network of mutual obligation and support is what allows people to survive in a place where individual effort alone would never be enough. Religion is woven through everything, but it's practical religion. The gods control the flood, the weather, the fertility of the fields. You make offerings not out of abstract devotion, but because the relationship between humans and divine forces needs to be maintained. Small shrines dot the village, tended by whoever has the time and inclination. The great temples with their armies of priests are far away in the cities. Here, worship is personal and immediate. As evening approaches and the heat begins to ease, life stirs again. The animals need tending. The evening meal requires preparation, and there's often work that can only be done in the cooler hours. Fishermen head out onto the river with their nets and traps. Farmers check their irrigation channels one more time. Women gather to share the work of preparing food and the equally important work of sharing news and gossip. The Nile at sunset is a ribbon of gold cutting through the brown landscape. Birds wheel overhead, heading to their roosts. The sound of water lapping against the banks mingles with the voices of children playing their last games before dark. For a few minutes, before the sun disappears entirely, the world is painted in colours that make even this harsh land seem gentle and welcoming. Night brings different sounds: the splash of fish jumping, the call of night birds, the rustle of wind through the palm fronds. Sometimes, if you're very quiet, you can hear the sound of water moving through the irrigation channels, carrying life to sleeping fields. The darkness is complete here, broken only by fires and oil lamps and the occasional torch. The stars are brilliant in the clear desert air, so bright they seem close enough to touch. Your bed is simple, a mat of woven reeds, perhaps a wooden headrest that serves as a pillow. In winter, you might need a blanket woven from wool or linen. In summer, even a thin sheet can feel like too much. You sleep lightly, always listening for the sounds that might mean trouble. A change in the wind that could bring a sandstorm. The splash that might indicate someone is at your fishing nets. The cry that could mean illness or injury in a neighbouring house. But most nights, you sleep the deep sleep of someone who has worked hard and honestly, who has done what needed to be done to keep life going for another day. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same rhythms, the same careful balance between human effort and natural forces. It's not an easy life, but it's a life with meaning and purpose, where every action has consequences and every person has a role to play. The flood season changes everything. When the Nile rises, covering the fields with rich brown water, the agricultural work stops and different rhythms take over. This is when the great building projects happen, when farmers become labourers, carrying stones for temples or digging canals that will serve the kingdom for generations. It's also when festivals and celebrations are most common, when the accumulated wealth of the harvest season can be spent on joy and community. The flood is both blessing and terror. When it comes at the right time and reaches the right height, it means abundance. Crops will grow tall and thick, granaries will be full, and families will sleep easy through the coming year. But if the flood is too high or too low, too early or too late, disaster follows as surely as sunrise. The Nile gives life, but it gives it on its own terms, and those terms are not always kind. Children grow up understanding this balance instinctively. They learn to read the river's moods, to spot the signs that indicate a good flood or a bad one. They learn which plants can be eaten when food is scarce, how to set traps for birds and small animals, how to find water when the usual sources run dry. Education here is not abstract, but intensely practical, focused on the skills needed to survive and thrive in this particular place. Women's work and men's work overlap more than in many societies, though certain tasks are traditionally divided. Women often manage the household finances, such as they are, and make the decisions about when to plant and harvest. Men typically handle the heavy labour of construction and irrigation. But during critical times, everyone does whatever needs doing. The luxury of rigid gender roles is something only the wealthy can afford. Trade connects your village to the wider world, but in limited ways. Surplus grain might be exchanged for metal tools, or pottery made in distant workshops. Salt, precious for preserving food, comes from far away. Occasionally, exotic goods pass through. Spices from the south, cedar wood from the north, precious stones from the eastern deserts. But most of what you use is made locally, by hands, from materials that come from the land around you. The rhythm of the seasons dominates everything. The flood season, when the river rises and the land is underwater. The growing season, when the fields are planted and tended. The harvest season, when the year's success or failure is determined. Each season brings its own tasks, its own celebrations, its own anxieties. The calendar is not abstract but lived, measured in the height of the river and the colour of the grain. Disease is a constant presence, but it's faced with the same practical acceptance as drought or flood. Remedies are passed down through generations. Which herbs help with fever, how to set a broken bone, what to do when someone is bitten by a snake. Some treatments work, others don't, and often there's no way to know which is which until it's too late. Life is precious because it's fragile, and every day without disaster is a day to be grateful for. Death, when it comes, is faced with a mixture of grief and resignation. The wealthy can afford elaborate mummification and grand tombs, but ordinary people make do with simpler rites. The body is wrapped in linen, buried with a few precious possessions, and remembered in the stories told around evening fires. The afterlife is hoped for, but not guaranteed, and the focus remains on living well in this world, rather than preparing for the next. As night deepens and the village settles into sleep, the eternal sounds continue. The river flowing past, carrying silt and fish and the dreams of people whose lives depend on its generosity. The wind whispering through the palm fronds, the distant call of a night bird hunting in the marshes. These are the sounds that have accompanied human sleep beside the Nile for thousands of years. the lullaby of a civilization that learned to thrive in one of the world's most challenging environments. And in the morning, when the sun rises again over the eastern desert, the cycle will begin anew. The bread will be baked, the fields will be tended, the river will be watched and respected and depended upon. Life will continue in its ancient rhythm, simple and complex, harsh and beautiful, precarious and enduring. The morning arrives, as it always does, in this forgotten corner of the world, not with fanfare or ceremony, but with the slow emergence of grey light filtering through the cracks in your mud brick walls. You don't wake to the sound of roosters crowing or church bells ringing in the distance. You wake because your body has learned the rhythm of survival, the internal clock that tells you when the day's work must begin if you hope to see another sunset. Your dwelling sits along the banks of the great river, part of a collection of similar structures that could generously be called a village. The houses lean against each other like tired friends, their walls built from the same Nile mud that floods and recedes with the seasons. Your home is small, perhaps 20 paces from wall to wall, with a flat roof that serves as both ceiling and workspace when the weather permits. The walls are thick, built to keep out the heat of the day and the chill of the night, though they succeed only partially in either task. During the flood season, you can feel the moisture seeping through, turning the hard-packed earth floors into something soft and yielding. During the dry months, the walls crack, and you spend precious time mixing new mud to fill the gaps. Your roof is made of palm fronds and reeds, laid thick and bound with rope made from papyrus. It leaks when the rains come hard, which they do rarely but with great enthusiasm. You've learned to position your few possessions carefully, keeping them away from the spots where water tends to gather and drip. Inside, the space is divided not by walls, but by function and necessity. Near the entrance, you keep your tools. A wooden hoe with a blade shaped from a piece of copper that your grandfather's grandfather might have used. A sickle for cutting grain when the time comes. A few baskets woven from reeds, always in need of repair. These tools represent the difference between eating and starving, between having shelter and sleeping under the stars. The center of your home is dominated by a grinding stone, a massive piece of granite that your family has used for generations to turn grain into flour. It's worn smooth by countless hands, and the sound it makes when you work the smaller stone against it has become the rhythm of your daily life. Near the grinding stone, you keep your store of grain, such as it is, barley mostly, some emmer wheat if the harvest was good. The grain is kept in large ceramic jars, sealed with mud and marked with simple scratches that help you remember which jar holds what. Against one wall, you've built a small shrine. Nothing elaborate, just a niche in the mud brick where you place offerings to the gods who govern your daily existence. Taweret, the hippo goddess who protects women in childbirth. Khnum, the ram-headed god who controls the Nile's flood. Renanutet, the cobra goddess who watches over the harvest. You leave small offerings here. A piece of bread when you can spare it. A cup of beer. A flower picked from the riverbank. Your bed is a wooden frame strung with rope, raised slightly off the ground to keep you away from scorpions and other creatures that prefer the cool earth. You have a thin mattress stuffed with straw and a linen sheet that you wash in the river when time permits. In winter, you add whatever blankets you can manage, usually wool from the village sheep. The light in your home comes from small oil lamps, simple clay bowls filled with animal fat or castor oil, with a wick made from twisted linen. You use these sparingly because oil is precious, and the light they provide is dim and flickering. Most of your indoor work happens during the day, when light filters through the doorway and the small windows high in the walls. Your cooking area is near the door, where smoke can escape more easily. You have a few ceramic pots of different sizes, some wooden bowls, and a bread oven that you share with your neighbors. The oven is built outside, a dome of mud brick that holds heat well and can bake several loaves at once. Bread is the foundation of every meal, and the process of making it is constant and unforgiving. Water comes from the river, carried in ceramic jars that you balance on your head or shoulders. The river water is muddy and needs to settle before you can use it for drinking. You keep several jars at different stages. Fresh water from the morning's trip to the river, water that's been sitting for a day, allowing the sediment to settle. Water that's been boiled for drinking, though you save fuel when you can by drinking the settled water directly. Your few personal possessions are kept in a wooden chest that doubles as a seat, a spare tunic, a cloak for cold nights, a comb made from wood, a small copper mirror, polished until it gleams, a necklace of blue faience beads that your mother gave you. These things represent not just utility, but identity, the small markers that distinguish you from your neighbors and connect you to your family's history. Outside your door, you maintain a small garden plot where you grow onions, garlic, and lettuce when the season permits. The soil here is rich from centuries of Nile floods, but it requires constant attention. You weed, water, and tend these plants with the same care you'd give to a sick child, because they might mean the difference between a meal with flavor and one without. The village around you follows the same pattern of survival. Your neighbors live in similar homes, face similar challenges, share similar hopes. There's Kaimwaset, who's skilled at repairing fishing nets and always seems to have dried fish to trade. Neferti, whose beer is the best in the village and who knows which herbs can ease a fever. Amenhotep, who's strong enough to help with the heaviest work and who never asks for more than his fair share in return. The rhythm of your day begins before dawn when you rise to begin the bread-making process. You take grain from your storage jars and measure it carefully, knowing that what you use today cannot be replaced until the next harvest. You grind the grain by hand, working the stone in circles until you have flour, picking out the inevitable pieces of grit and stone that would break your teeth. You mix the flour with water and a bit of sourdough starter that you maintain carefully, feeding it regularly to keep the wild yeast alive. You shape the dough into flat loaves and set them aside to rise while you tend to other morning tasks. When the shared oven is available, you bake your bread, filling your home with the smell that means survival. After the bread is secured, you turn to the day's main work. If it's planting season, you're in the fields, working the rich mud left by the flood, placing seeds with the precision that comes from knowing that a poorly planted field means a hungry winter. If it's growing season, you're tending the crops, pulling weeds, adjusting irrigation channels, protecting the young plants from birds and insects. During harvest time, your entire world revolves around cutting, gathering, and storing grain. You work from before dawn until after dark, because timing is everything. Grain left too long in the field can be lost to birds, wind, or the early floods. Grain harvested too early won't store properly and may rot before you need it. Between the major agricultural seasons, there's always other work. Repairing tools, maintaining your home, spinning flax into thread, weaving cloth, making pottery, gathering reeds for basketry. Nothing in your world comes ready-made. Everything you use, you must either make yourself or trade for with the products of your own labor. The flood season brings its own rhythm. When the Nile rises and covers the fields, you can't farm, but there's still work to be done. This is when you repair your home, make new tools, work on crafts that you can trade, and participate in the community projects that keep the village functioning. You might help repair the shrine, work on maintaining the irrigation channels, or assist with the larger construction projects that the local officials demand. Your relationship with the river is complex and intimate. The Nile provides the water you drink, the mud for your bricks, the fish that supplement your diet, and the annual flood that makes agriculture possible. But the river is also unpredictable and dangerous. Floods that are too high can destroy your home and wash away your stored grain. Floods that are too low mean poor harvests and hungry times ahead. You read the river like others read scrolls, watching for the subtle signs that indicate what kind of year it will be. The color of the water as it begins to rise. The amount of silt it carries. The height it reaches at certain landmarks. The timing of its peak and recession. This knowledge, passed down through generations, helps you prepare for what's coming, though it can never eliminate the uncertainty that governs your life. Trade is limited, but essential to your survival. You can't produce everything you need, so you must exchange your surplus for goods produced by others. You might trade grain for fish, pottery for cloth, or your labor for access to specialized tools. These exchanges happen in the village, at periodic markets, or through traveling merchants who connect your small community to the larger world. The goods you can acquire through trade expand your world slightly beyond pure subsistence. Salt for preserving food, copper for tools and jewelry, linen for clothing, incense for religious ceremonies, beer ingredients for brewing, small luxuries like honey or spices that make the daily routine more bearable. Your social world is bounded by the village and the surrounding fields, but within these limits, relationships are complex and vital. Marriage connects families and creates networks of mutual support. Children represent both the future of the community and additional mouths to feed. Elders carry knowledge and wisdom, but require care when they can no longer work. Everyone has a role, and everyone's contribution matters. Religious practice is woven into every aspect of daily life. You make offerings at your household shrine each morning, asking for protection and prosperity. You participate in village festivals that mark the agricultural seasons. You contribute to the maintenance of the local temple, even though the priests who serve there live very different lives from yours. You wear amulets for protection and speak the names of gods who govern your specific concerns. The afterlife is real and immediate in your understanding of the world. You know that how you live now affects what happens after death, and you try to live according to Ma'at, the principle of truth, justice, and cosmic order. This isn't just religious observance, it's practical wisdom. A community where people treat each other fairly is more likely to survive the challenges that constantly threaten small agricultural settlements. Your health depends on a combination of practical knowledge, religious belief, and simple luck. You know which herbs can ease pain, reduce fever, or settle an upset stomach. You understand the importance of cleanliness, especially around food preparation and water storage. You know how to set a broken bone and treat wounds. But you also know that many illnesses are beyond your ability to treat, and you rely on prayer, amulets, and the intervention of the gods. Death is a constant presence in your world, but not a morbid obsession. Children die young from diseases that strike without warning. Adults die from accidents, infections, and the gradual wearing down that comes from a life of physical labor. The elderly die when their bodies finally give out. You mourn the dead, honor their memory, and continue with the work of living. Your understanding of the larger world is limited, but not non-existent. You know there's a pharaoh who rules Egypt, though you've never seen him and probably never will. You know there are other countries beyond Egypt's borders, places where different gods are worshipped and different customs followed. You know there are cities where people live very differently from how you live, though the details of urban life remain mysterious to you. The seasons provide the framework for your understanding of time. You don't count years the way scribes do. You remember them by their characteristics. The year of the low flood, the year of the early harvest, the year when the fever took so many children, the year when the tax collectors demanded extra grain. Your personal history is embedded in these natural and social cycles. As the day progresses toward evening, you begin the process of securing what you've accomplished and preparing for the night ahead. Tools are cleaned and stored. Animals are brought to shelter. Food is prepared for the evening meal. The grinding stone is covered to protect it from dust and moisture. Oil lamps are filled and wicks trimmed in preparation for the darkness. The evening meal is simple but important. Bread forms the foundation, accompanied by whatever else is available. Onions and garlic from your garden. Fish from the river if someone has been successful. Beer brewed from barley. Cheese made from goat's milk. The meal is eaten in the doorway or on the roof, where you can catch whatever breeze might be stirring and watch the stars appear in the darkening sky. Conversation during the evening meal covers the events of the day, plans for tomorrow, news from other parts of the village, and the eternal concerns of farming people. Will the flood be good this year? Are the crops growing well? Has anyone seen signs of pests or disease? These aren't casual topics. They're matters of survival that require constant attention and discussion. As full darkness falls, activity winds down quickly. Oil for lamps is too precious to waste on unnecessary illumination, and tomorrow will bring another full day of work that requires rest to sustain. You might spend a short time in conversation with family members, working on a small craft project that can be done by touch, or simply sitting quietly and listening to the sounds of the village settling into sleep. Your sleep is governed by the natural rhythms of light and darkness, interrupted occasionally by the sounds that mean potential trouble. The cry of a child who might be sick, the sound of animals moving restlessly, which could indicate the presence of predators, the distant sound of voices that might mean news arriving from other villages. But most nights pass quietly, and you sleep the deep sleep of someone whose body has been fully used during the day. This pattern repeats with variations throughout the year, shaped by the agricultural calendar, the river's behavior, and the unpredictable events that can disrupt the most careful plans. Illness, accident, conflict with neighboring villages, demands from government officials, changes in weather patterns, the death of key community members. Your life requires constant adaptation to circumstances largely beyond your control. Yet within these constraints, you find moments of satisfaction and even joy. The successful completion of a harvest, the birth of a healthy child, a particularly good batch of beer, a tool that works exactly as intended, a day when everything goes according to plan, a sunset that reminds you of the beauty that exists alongside the struggle. Your legacy is not measured in monuments or written records, but in the continuation of the life patterns that have sustained your community for generations. The knowledge you pass to your children about reading the river, working the soil, and maintaining the relationships that make survival possible. The improvements you make to your home, your tools, and your land that will benefit those who come after you. The skills you've mastered represent a form of wealth that can't be stolen or lost to flood or fire. How to make bread that nourishes, how to build structures that shelter, how to grow food from mud and water, how to work with others to accomplish tasks that no individual could manage alone, how to find meaning and purpose in the endless cycle of planting, tending, harvesting, and beginning again. Your relationship with the land is intimate and practical. You know every field in your area, understand which spots drain well and which hold water, recognize the subtle differences in soil that affect how crops grow. You can predict weather patterns based on the behavior of birds, the appearance of clouds, and the feel of the wind. You understand the river's moods and can read its messages about what kind of year lies ahead. This knowledge comes not from books or formal education, but from daily experience accumulated over years and passed down through generations. It's knowledge that can't be separated from its context, can't be written down and transferred to someone who hasn't lived it. It's the wisdom of people who must understand their environment completely because their survival depends on getting it right. Your world is small in terms of geography, but infinite in terms of the complexity required to navigate it successfully. Every decision has consequences that ripple through the months and years ahead. Every relationship affects your ability to weather the crises that inevitably arise. Every skill you master increases your chances of not just surviving, but thriving within the constraints that define your existence. The gods who govern your world are not distant abstractions but immediate presences who affect the daily details of your life. Sobek, the crocodile god, who must be appeased when you fish in dangerous waters. Nepre, the grain god, whose favor determines whether your crops will flourish. Bes, the dwarf god, who protects your home from evil spirits. These deities are part of your practical toolkit for managing uncertainty and risk. Your prayers are specific and immediate, for good health, for sufficient rain, for protection from accidents, for success in the day's work, for the safety of family members, for the prosperity of the community. You don't ask for wealth or power in the abstract, but for the concrete blessings that make life sustainable and meaningful within your circumstances. The festivals and ceremonies that mark your religious calendar are also social and economic events that strengthen community bonds and provide opportunities for trade and matchmaking. They offer breaks in the routine of work, chances to enjoy special foods and entertainment, and reminders of the larger cosmic order of which your small life is a part. As night deepens and the village grows quiet, you rest knowing that tomorrow will bring another opportunity to participate in the ancient dance of survival that has sustained your people for countless generations. The work will be hard, the uncertainties many, the margin for error small. But you will meet these challenges with the accumulated wisdom of your ancestors and the support of your community, finding in the simple fact of endurance a form of triumph that needs no monument to validate its worth. Your dreams, when they come, are filled with the images and concerns of your waking life. Fields of grain swaying in the breeze, the river rising to exactly the right level, tools that work smoothly and efficiently, family members healthy and safe, the simple, profound satisfactions of a life lived in harmony with the rhythms of the natural world and the needs of the human community. And when morning comes again, as it always does, you will rise and begin once more the patient work of turning possibility into sustenance, uncertainty into security, and survival into something that approaches contentment. We find ourselves returning to those same fields, the same stretch of earth along the Nile, where the ancient routines continue their endless rhythm. The sun rises as it has for countless generations, casting long shadows across rows of barley and wheat that shimmer in the morning light. There's a comfort in this constancy, in the way certain patterns persist regardless of the chaos that might swirl beyond the village boundaries. Here, where the river meets the cultivated land, life moves with the patience of stone. The farmers emerge from their mud brick houses as the first birds begin their calls, carrying the same tools their fathers carried, walking the same paths worn smooth by generations of bare feet and sandaled steps. They understand their place in this ancient dance between earth and sky, between the flooding season and the harvest, between the demands of survival and the small pleasures that make survival worthwhile. The irrigation channels run like veins through the fields, carrying the Nile's gift to every corner of cultivated ground. Someone checks the water levels, adjusting the simple gates that control the flow. It's precise work, requiring an intimate knowledge of how water moves, how much each crop requires, how to balance the needs of one field against another. This knowledge passes quietly from one generation to the next, not through formal instruction, but through years of watching, listening, participating in the slow apprenticeship of rural life. Near the granaries, women sort through the previous season's grain. separating the good from the questionable, preparing what can be ground into flour for the day's bread. Their hands move with practiced efficiency, feeling for the weight and texture that indicates quality. They've done this work since childhood, developing an intuitive understanding of how grain should look, feel, smell. It's knowledge that can't be learned from scrolls or lectures, only from years of handling the raw materials that sustain life. Children help where they can, carrying water, scaring birds from the fields, learning through observation and gradual participation. They absorb the rhythms of agricultural life without conscious effort, understanding when to plant, when to harvest, how to read the signs that indicate a good flood year or a lean one. Their education happens naturally, embedded in the daily work that keeps the community fed and functioning. The workshops hum with quiet activity. Potters shape clay vessels for storing grain and water, their hands moving in patterns learned through years of practice. Weavers work at their looms, creating the linen cloth that forms the basis of most clothing. Carpenters repair tools and furniture, their work essential but rarely celebrated. These craftsmen represent the foundation of civilized life, creating the objects that make survival not just possible, but bearable. In the markets, traders display their goods with the understated confidence of people who know their products intimately. Vegetables from gardens along the river, pottery from local workshops, tools forged by village smiths. The negotiations are conducted with the ritual courtesy of long-established relationships. Everyone knows everyone, and reputation matters more than immediate profit. Trust, once lost, might never be recovered in a community this small. The religious observances continue their ancient patterns, daily offerings at the local shrine, prayers for favorable floods, ceremonies marking the agricultural calendar. These rituals provide structure and meaning, connecting the practical work of farming to larger questions of purpose and belonging. The gods who govern the weather, the fertility of the land, the health of animals and humans, receive their due attention. This isn't superstition, but practical wisdom, acknowledging the forces beyond human control that determine success or failure. Evening brings the community together around cooking fires and oil lamps. Meals are simple but satisfying, made from ingredients grown and prepared locally. Bread baked from grain harvested in nearby fields, vegetables from gardens tended by neighbours, fish caught in the familiar waters of the Nile. The conversation flows easily, covering the small dramas and concerns that make up village life. Who needs help with their harvest? Which fields are producing well? What repairs are needed on the irrigation system? As darkness settles over the village, the sounds change. The business of the day gives way to quieter activities. Mothers put children to bed with stories that have been told for generations. Craftsmen work by lamplight on projects that require careful attention. Couples talk quietly about their hopes and concerns, making plans for the coming season, discussing family matters that require thoughtful consideration. The night sky, unmarred by the light pollution of later ages, reveals its full glory. The stars that guide navigation, mark the seasons, and inspire religious devotion shine with brilliant clarity. The farmers know these patterns intimately, using them to time their planting and harvesting, to navigate during nighttime fishing expeditions, to mark the passage of time in a world without clocks or calendars. This is life at its most fundamental level, not the grand politics of pharaohs and temples, not the international trade that brings exotic goods to the wealthy, but the basic human work of growing food, raising families, maintaining the small communities that form the foundation of civilization. It's work that connects people directly to the natural world, to the cycles of flood and drought, growth and harvest, life and death that govern all existence. The rhythm of this life is measured not in hours, but in seasons, not in individual achievement, but in collective survival. Success means having enough grain stored for the lean months, enough children surviving to carry on the family line, enough cooperation within the community to maintain the irrigation systems and defend against occasional threats. It's a modest definition of prosperity, but one that acknowledges the basic requirements of human flourishing. In this world, innovation happens slowly and carefully. New techniques for farming or crafting are tested thoroughly before being adopted widely. Change that threatens the delicate balance between human needs and natural resources is viewed with suspicion. The conservative approach isn't born from lack of imagination, but from the hard-won understanding that mistakes in this environment can be fatal. The social bonds that hold the community together are forged through shared work and mutual dependence. When someone's house needs repair, neighbors contribute labor and materials. When illness strikes a family, others step in to help with their fields and animals. When the flood is late or insufficient, the community shares resources to help everyone survive until the next season. This isn't charity, but enlightened self-interest, the recognition that individual survival depends on collective resilience. As the night deepens and the village settles into sleep, the eternal sounds of the river continue. The gentle lapping of water against the banks, the distant calls of night birds, the soft rustle of reeds in the evening breeze. These sounds have provided the soundtrack to human life in this place for thousands of years. They'll continue long after the current generation has passed, marking time with the patience of the natural world. Tomorrow will bring the same routines, the same challenges, the same small satisfactions. The sun will rise, the work will begin, the community will continue its ancient pattern of survival and adaptation. There's something deeply reassuring in this continuity, in the way human life can find stability and meaning within the larger patterns of the natural world. The sun had not yet appeared over the distant hills when Katie felt the familiar tug of responsibility pulling him from sleep. In the pale light filtering through the reed mat that covered their doorway, he could hear his wife Nennet already stirring, her movements careful and practiced in the cramped space they shared with their 3 children and elderly mother. This was how every day began in their village along the Nile, with the quiet understanding that survival depended on rising before the heat became unbearable and the day's work too pressing to delay. Their home was simple, built from mud brick and reeds, with walls that had been patched countless times against the seasonal floods and the relentless desert wind. The floor was packed earth, swept clean each evening, but somehow always dusty by morning. A small shrine in the corner held clay figurines of protective household gods, their painted faces worn smooth by generations of offerings and prayers. The scent of last night's cooking fire still lingered, mixing with the earthy smell of the Nile and the distant promise of another hot day. Katie's family had lived in this village for as long as anyone could remember, their lives governed by the rhythm of the great river that gave life to everything around them. The Nile was not just water to them, it was the heartbeat of their existence, the divine force that determined whether they would feast or starve, whether their children would thrive or merely survive. Every aspect of their daily routine revolved around this understanding, from the prayers they whispered at dawn to the careful way they rationed grain when the floods came late. As Katie stepped outside, his bare feet found the familiar path worn smooth by countless mornings like this one. The village was awakening slowly, smoke beginning to rise from other cooking fires, the soft murmur of voices carrying across the still air. Children emerged from doorways, already assigned their daily tasks of gathering fuel, carrying water, or watching over younger siblings. Women moved with practiced efficiency, beginning the long process of preparing the day's bread while keeping one eye on the eastern horizon, where the sun god Ra would soon begin his daily journey across the sky. The fields stretched out beyond the village, a patchwork of green that spoke to the endless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting that defined their lives. Irrigation channels cut neat lines through the landscape, carrying the life-giving water of the Nile to crops of barley, wheat, and the vegetables. These channels required constant maintenance, and Katie could see other farmers already at work, clearing debris and checking the flow of water with the kind of attention that comes from knowing your family's survival depends on getting it right. The work was backbreaking and never-ending. During flood season, they would wait anxiously to see whether the waters would rise too high, washing away their homes, or too low, leaving their fields parched and useless. When the floods receded, there was the urgent rush to plant before the fertile silt dried out completely. Then came months of careful tending, protecting young shoots from birds and insects, ensuring the irrigation channels flowed properly, and praying to the gods for favourable weather. Nanette joined him outside, carrying their youngest child on her hip while balancing a water jar on her head. She moved with the graceful efficiency of someone who had been performing these same motions since childhood, her steps sure and steady despite the uneven ground. Together, they walked toward the river, joining the stream of villagers who made this journey every morning to collect the water that would sustain them through another day. The Nile in the early morning was a sight that never lost its power to inspire reverence. The water moved slowly, its surface reflecting the gradually lightening sky, while papyrus reeds swayed gently along the banks. Birds called from the marshes, and occasionally a fish would break the surface, sending ripples across the calm water. This was their lifeline, their god, their everything, and they approached it with the respect and gratitude it deserved. As they filled their jars, Katie exchanged quiet words with his neighbours about the day ahead. There was always work to be done in the fields, but today they would also need to repair a section of irrigation channel that had been damaged by the previous night's wind. It was the kind of community effort that required everyone to contribute, from the strongest men to the oldest women who could still weave reeds into the mats needed for reinforcement. The sun was beginning to appear above the horizon now, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink that reminded them of the divine presence watching over their daily struggles. They offered brief prayers of gratitude for another day, another chance to provide for their families, another opportunity to live in harmony with the eternal rhythms that governed their world. Returning to their home, Nanette began the process of preparing the morning meal, while Katie gathered the tools he would need for the day's work. Their breakfast was simple but nourishing. Flatbread made from barley flour, a handful of dates, and weak beer that provided both sustenance and safety in a world where clean water was never guaranteed. The children ate quickly, eager to begin their own daily tasks, while the adults savoured these few quiet moments before the heat of the day made every movement an effort. The village operated on the principle of collective responsibility that had sustained them for generations. Everyone knew their role. Everyone contributed according to their abilities, and everyone shared in both the hardships and the small victories that marked their passage through each season. When someone's roof needed repair, neighbours appeared with materials and willing hands. When illness struck a family, others stepped in to help with their fields. When the harvest was particularly good, the surplus was shared among those whose crops had failed. This cooperation extended to their relationship with the divine powers that controlled their fate. The village priest, an elderly man who had inherited his position from his father, led them in daily prayers and seasonal festivals that honoured the gods responsible for their well-being. These ceremonies were not elaborate affairs like those performed in the great temples of the cities, but they were sincere expressions of faith and gratitude that reinforced the bonds holding their community together. Religious observance was woven into every aspect of their daily lives, from the small offerings left at household shrines to the careful attention paid to omens and signs that might indicate divine favor or displeasure. When a child was born, specific rituals ensured the protection of household gods. When someone died, the community came together to perform the rites that would help the deceased navigate the dangerous journey to the afterlife. The heat of midday brought a natural pause to the most strenuous work, a time when families gathered in whatever shade they could find to rest and share the main meal of the day. Conversation during these breaks often turned to practical matters. Which fields were producing well, whether fishing had been good, what news had arrived from neighboring villages. But there was also time for storytelling, for the ancient tales that preserved their history and values, passing them down from one generation to the next through the simple act of repetition. Children listened to these stories with rapt attention, learning not just entertainment, but the fundamental principles that would guide their own lives. They heard about the importance of hard work, the value of community cooperation, the necessity of respecting the gods and the natural forces they controlled. They learned about their ancestors, about the great floods and droughts of the past, about heroes and villains whose actions had shaped the world they now inhabited. As the afternoon progressed and the heat began to subside, work resumed with renewed energy. The irrigation channels needed constant attention, and today's repair work required the combined efforts of several families. Men hauled reeds and mud, while women wove mats, and children carried tools and water. The work was hard but satisfying, each person contributing their skills to a project that would benefit everyone. The sense of accomplishment that came from completing such tasks was one of the few luxuries available to people whose lives were defined by necessity rather than choice. When the channel was repaired and water flowed freely once again, there was a moment of collective satisfaction, a brief pause to appreciate what they had achieved together before moving on to the next urgent task. Evening brought its own rituals and responsibilities. Animals needed to be fed and secured for the night. Tools required cleaning and maintenance. The day's grain needed to be processed and stored safely away from mice and insects. Children were bathed in the river and prepared for sleep, while adults tended to the countless small tasks that would make the next day's work possible. The evening meal was often the most social time of day, when extended families and neighbors gathered to share food and conversation. These gatherings reinforced the social bonds that held the community together, providing opportunities to resolve conflicts, arrange marriages, plan cooperative projects, and simply enjoy each other's company after long hours of individual labor. As darkness fell and the cooking fires burned low, families retreated to their homes for the night. The transition from day to night was gradual, marked by the changing sounds of the village as human activity gave way to the natural rhythms of the nocturnal world. Frogs began their evening chorus from the marshy areas near the river. Night birds called from the palm trees. The gentle lapping of water against the riverbank provided a constant, soothing background to the quiet conversations that continued in darkened doorways. Sleep came easily to people whose days were filled with physical labor and whose nights offered genuine rest. Children curled up on reed mats, their dreams perhaps filled with the stories they had heard and the games they had played. Adults lay down, knowing they had fulfilled their responsibilities to family and community, that they had done their part to maintain the delicate balance between human needs and natural forces that sustained their way of life. The night was not entirely peaceful, however. There were always concerns that could disturb sleep. The possibility of flood or drought, the health of family members, the adequacy of stored grain to last until the next harvest. These worries were part of the texture of their lives, constant companions that shaped their prayers and influenced their decisions, but never overwhelmed their fundamental resilience and determination to persevere. In the deepest part of the night, when even the most anxious had found sleep. The village rested under a canopy of stars that had watched over countless generations of their ancestors. The same constellations that guided the pharaoh's journey through the underworld also watched over these humble farmers, connecting them to the cosmic order that gave meaning to their daily struggles and seasonal cycles. Dawn would come again, as it always had and always would, bringing with it another day of work and worry, cooperation and celebration. The eternal rhythm of sunrise and sunset, flood and drought, planting and harvest would continue to govern their lives, just as it had governed the lives of their parents and grandparents, stretching back to the beginning of memory. This was the pattern of existence that sustained not just their village, but thousands of similar communities throughout the Nile Valley, each one a small thread in the vast tapestry of ancient Egyptian civilization. Their individual lives might seem insignificant when measured against the grand monuments and powerful rulers that dominated the historical record, but they were the foundation upon which everything else rested, the human bedrock that made possible the flourishing of one of history's greatest civilizations. The relationship between these village communities and the wider world of pharaohs and priests, cities and temples, was complex and often distant, but never entirely absent. They paid taxes in the form of grain and labor, contributed young men to the army when needed, and participated in the great festivals that marked the religious calendar of the kingdom. But their primary loyalty was to each other, to the land that sustained them, and to the ancient traditions that had proven their worth through countless generations of survival and adaptation. Their wisdom was practical rather than philosophical, their wealth measured in full granaries and healthy children rather than gold and precious stones. They understood the importance of working with natural forces rather than against them, of building communities based on mutual support rather than individual competition, of maintaining harmony between human needs and divine will. As the stars began to fade and the eastern sky showed the first hints of dawn, the village prepared to begin another day in the endless cycle that had sustained them for millennia. Children would wake to learn the skills they would need as adults. Men would return to fields that had fed their families since time immemorial. Women would continue the patient work of transforming raw materials into the necessities of life, and all of them would participate in the quiet miracle of human persistence, the stubborn refusal to surrender in the face of forces beyond their control. This was their gift to history, not monuments or treasures, but the simple demonstration that ordinary people could create meaningful lives in harmony with their environment and each other. Their legacy was written not in stone, but in the continuation of traditions, the preservation of knowledge, the raising of children who would carry forward the values and practices that had proven their worth through countless trials. The morning light revealed a landscape that bore the marks of human partnership with nature, fields laid out to capture every drop of precious water, homes built to withstand both flood and drought, communities organized to provide security and support for all their members. It was a testament to the power of cooperation, patience, and respect for the natural world that sustained them. And so, another day began in the endless rhythm that connected them to their ancestors and would bind them to their descendants, each sunrise bringing new challenges and new opportunities, each sunset marking another small victory in the long struggle to create meaning and security in an uncertain world. The days themselves followed patterns older than memory, not the rigid schedules of palaces or the measured hours of scribes, but rhythms that pulsed with the very heartbeat of the river. You woke when light first touched the water, not because anyone commanded it, but because your body had learned to move with the ancient dance between sun and Nile. Sleep came when darkness settled over the fields like a familiar blanket, heavy with the scent of cooling earth and the distant murmur of water against the banks. There was no rushing here, no urgent summons from officials or frantic preparations for ceremonies. Time moved like the river itself, steady and unhurried, carrying each day forward into the next without fanfare or announcement. The village measured seasons not by royal decrees or religious festivals, but by the height of the water, the color of the soil, the behavior of the birds that nested in the papyrus reeds. When the flood season arrived, it came not as a dramatic event, but as a gradual transformation. The river would begin to swell, slowly at first, then with growing confidence until it spread across the fields, like a vast mirror reflecting the sky. This was not destruction, but renewal, the annual gift that made all life possible. The villagers would watch the rising water with the patience of people who had witnessed this miracle countless times, knowing that beneath the surface, the fertile silt was settling into the soil like a blessing. During these months of inundation, when the fields lay submerged and the regular work of farming paused, the village took on a different rhythm. It was a time for repair and reflection, for tasks that required patience rather than urgency. Women would sit in doorways, spinning thread from flax fibers, while children played simple games with stones and sticks. Men would mend fishing nets or carve new handles for tools, their hands moving with the unconscious skill that comes from a lifetime of practice. The conversations during these quiet months were unhurried affairs, stories told and retold with small variations, memories shared like precious heirlooms passed from hand to hand. An old fisherman might describe the great flood of his youth, when the water rose higher than anyone had seen before, transforming familiar landmarks into mysterious islands. A grandmother would tell her grandchildren about the patterns she read in the flight of ibises, knowledge handed down through generations of careful observation. There was a profound peace in this predictability, in knowing that tomorrow would bring the same gentle tasks, the same familiar faces, the same gradual progression through seasons that had sustained this way of life for centuries. No armies would march through this quiet corner of the world. No great monuments would rise from these modest fields. The village existed in a space between the grand narratives of empire and the eternal rhythms of nature, finding its purpose in the simple act of enduring. When the waters finally receded, revealing fields refreshed and ready for planting, the work began again with the same steady patience. Seeds were scattered by hand, each one a small act of faith in the coming harvest. The soil was worked with wooden ploughs, drawn by oxen whose ancestors had performed the same service for generations past. There was something almost ceremonial in these movements, a ritual repetition that connected each farmer to the long line of those who had worked this same earth before. The growing season brought its own quiet satisfactions. Watching the first green shoots emerge from the dark soil, observing the subtle changes in color and height as the crops matured, learning to read the signs that would tell when the grain was ready for harvest. These were skills that could not be learned from books or taught in schools, but had to be absorbed slowly, through seasons of careful attention and patient practice. Even the harvest, though it required long hours and considerable effort, carried none of the frantic urgency that marked life in the great cities. The grain was cut when it was ready, gathered when the weather permitted, stored when the work was done. There was time for rest between tasks, time for conversation, time to appreciate the weight of the grain in your hands and the satisfaction of barns filled with the season's bounty. The village children grew up immersed in this rhythm, learning without formal instruction how to read the subtle signs of weather and season, how to work with their hands, how to find contentment in the repetition of essential tasks. They played games that mimicked the work they would one day perform, building miniature irrigation channels in the mud, fashioning dolls from corn husks, racing toy boats made from papyrus reeds. As they matured, they would gradually take on more responsibility, moving from observation to participation to eventual mastery of the skills that sustained their community. A boy might begin by scaring birds from the grain fields, progress to helping with the harvest, and eventually learn to guide the plough himself. A girl might start by gathering eggs, learn to tend the vegetable garden, and in time become skilled in the complex art of managing a household's many needs. This was education, not as formal learning, but as gradual immersion. Knowledge passed along through demonstration and practice, rather than lectures and examinations. The wisdom of the village was collective, held not in any single mind, but in the accumulated experience of generations who had learned to live in harmony with the river's gifts and constraints. There were, of course, challenges and hardships. Years when the flood failed to come, leaving the fields dry and the harvest meager. Seasons when disease struck the animals or pests destroyed the crops. Times when the river's course shifted, requiring new channels to be dug or old ones to be abandoned. But even these difficulties were met with the same patient endurance that characterized all aspects of village life. When crisis struck, the community responded not with panic, but with the quiet determination of people who understood that survival depended on cooperation and mutual support. Grain would be shared, from those who had surplus to those who faced shortage. Labor would be pooled to repair flood damage or clear blocked channels. Knowledge would be exchanged about new techniques or alternative crops that might help weather the current difficulty. This mutual dependence created bonds that went deeper than mere neighborliness. In a world where individual survival was impossible, the welfare of each was intimately connected to the welfare of all. A family's prosperity depended not just on their own efforts, but on the health of the entire community's agricultural system. A person's security rested not on accumulated wealth, but on the network of relationships that would provide support in times of need. The religious practices of the village reflected this same spirit of practical cooperation with forces beyond human control. The gods were not distant figures demanding elaborate ceremonies, but familiar presences who needed to be acknowledged and respected as partners in the ongoing work of survival. Offerings were simple things, portions of bread or beer, flowers gathered from the riverbank, small tokens of gratitude for the continuing gifts of sun and soil and water. The festivals that marked the agricultural year were community affairs, celebrations that brought everyone together to acknowledge shared dependence on the river's bounty. These were times for dancing and singing, for sharing special foods and telling stories, for reinforcing the bonds that held the village together through good seasons and bad. Even death, when it came, was woven into this pattern of communal support and continuity. The deceased were mourned by the entire village, their contributions remembered and their absence acknowledged. But life continued, as it always had, with others stepping forward to take on the responsibilities that death had left vacant. Children were named for grandparents, carrying forward not just names, but the accumulated wisdom and skills of previous generations. This was a world without written records, where history lived in memory and tradition rather than in inscriptions on stone. The great events that chroniclers would later record, the rise and fall of dynasties, the construction of monuments, the conquest of distant lands, all of this took place beyond the horizon of village awareness. What mattered here was the immediate and the essential, the daily work that sustained life and the seasonal cycles that made that work possible. In the evening hours, when the day's tasks were completed and families gathered around cooking fires, there was time for the quiet pleasures that made life more than mere survival. Stories were told, simple songs were sung, children listened to the wisdom of their elders. The air would fill with the smoke of cooking fires and the gentle murmur of conversation, creating an atmosphere of peace and contentment that needed no external validation. This was happiness of a different order than the grand satisfaction sought by pharaohs and nobles. It was the happiness that comes from knowing your place in the world and finding that place good. The satisfaction of work well done, of community well served, of traditions well maintained. It was the deep contentment that arises from living in harmony with natural rhythms and accepting the limitations that those rhythms impose. As darkness settled over the village and the sounds of day gave way to the night chorus of insects and water birds, people would make their way to homes that were simple but sufficient, to beds that were humble but comfortable. They would fall asleep, not to the anxious calculations of ambition, but to the peaceful certainty that tomorrow would bring the same essential work, the same fundamental rhythms, the same quiet satisfactions that had sustained their ancestors and would, with care and patience, sustain their children in turn. In this unremarkable village along an unremarkable stretch of the Nile, life proceeded according to principles that needed no elaboration or defense. The river provided, the community endured, the seasons turned in their ancient pattern. It was enough. It was more than enough. The flickering oil lamps have burned low in the village. The day's work is done. The last embers of the cooking fires are dying to glowing coals, and families have settled into their simple homes for another night along the ancient Nile. The rhythm that has sustained this community through countless seasons continues unchanged, as steady as the river's flow and as reliable as the rising sun. But seasons do change, even here. The floods come and recede, crops flourish or fail. Children grow into adults who take their place in the endless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. Some years bring abundance, others scarcity. Yet through it all, the village endures. Tonight, as the wind whispers through the date palms and the Nile murmurs its eternal song, the people rest. Tomorrow will bring the same tasks, the same challenges, the same small victories that have defined life here for generations. There will be bread to bake, fields to tend, animals to care for. There will be moments of laughter shared around the evening fire and quiet conversations as families gather for their simple meals. The children will learn the skills they need to survive and thrive in this harsh but generous land. They'll discover which plants heal and which harm, how to read the sky for signs of weather, when to plant and when to harvest. They'll hear the old stories told by firelight, tales that connect them to their ancestors and teach them their place in the great sweep of history. The village potter will continue shaping clay into vessels that hold water, grain, and oil. The weaver will work her loom, creating cloth that protects against sun and sand. The farmer will walk his fields at dawn, checking the growth of his crops and the condition of his irrigation channels. Each person contributing their skills to the community's survival, each playing their part in the ancient dance of life along the Nile. There's a profound peace in this continuity, this connection to something larger than any individual life. The people of this village are part of a story that stretches back thousands of years and will continue long after they're gone. Their daily rituals of work and rest, their seasonal celebrations, their careful tending of the land and each other all contribute to something enduring and meaningful. As the last light fades from the western sky and the stars emerge in their familiar patterns, the village settles into sleep. The river continues its journey toward the distant sea, carrying with it the silt that will nourish next year's crops. The desert wind carries the scents of jasmine and cooking fires, of dust and growing things. And in the morning, when the sun rises again over the eastern hills, the cycle will begin anew. The baker will light her oven. The farmer will check his fields. The children will run laughing through the narrow streets. Life will continue as it has for countless generations, simple and difficult and beautiful in its enduring rhythm. The village sleeps peacefully tonight, secure in its place along the eternal Nile, part of the great river of time that flows through all human experience. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges and rewards, but for now, there is rest. There is the quiet satisfaction of another day completed, another small contribution made to the ongoing story of human persistence and hope. In this humble place, far from the grand monuments and glittering palaces of the pharaohs, the true heart of ancient Egypt beats on, steady, patient, enduring. A reminder that history is made not just by kings and conquerors, but by ordinary people living ordinary lives with extraordinary grace and resilience. The Egyptian villages stirred as the first pale light crept across the eastern horizon, painting the mud brick houses in gentle amber hues. There was no sudden awakening, no jarring alarm to shatter the peaceful transition from night to day. Instead, life emerged gradually from the embrace of sleep, as natural and inevitable as the Nile's own rhythms. In the small dwellings that lined the village pathways, families began to move with the quiet efficiency born of countless mornings. Children rubbed sleep from their eyes, while mothers rekindled cooking fires from carefully preserved embers. The air filled with the soft sounds of daily preparation, the gentle scrape of grain being ground, the whispered conversations of early risers, the distant lowing of cattle awakening in their enclosures. The village itself seemed to breathe with the collective stirring of its inhabitants. Smoke began to curl upward from cooking fires, creating thin grey ribbons against the brightening sky. Dogs stretched and yawned before padding outside to investigate the new day's possibilities. Chickens emerged from their roosts, pecking and scratching in the dirt with renewed purpose. This was not a world of rigid schedules or mechanical precision. Time flowed here like the great river itself, measured not by the ticking of clocks but by the position of shadows, the warmth of the sun, and the ancient patterns that had governed life along the Nile for generations beyond memory. Each day began when it felt ready to begin, and the villagers moved in harmony with this natural cadence. As the sun climbed higher, casting longer shadows across the village pathways, the pace of activity gradually increased. Men emerged from their homes carrying the tools of their trade, simple implements worn smooth by countless hands, passed down from father to son like precious heirlooms. Women gathered water jars and headed toward the river, walking in small groups that moved with the practiced grace of those who had made this journey thousands of times before. The village was awakening not just to another day, but to another link in the endless chain of days that connected past to future, generation to generation. Here, in this quiet corner of ancient Egypt, life continued as it had for centuries, following rhythms as old and reliable as the stars themselves. The great pharaohs in their distant palaces might command armies and build monuments, but here in the village, the true heartbeat of Egypt pulsed steady and strong. Children helped their parents with the morning tasks, learning through observation and gentle guidance the skills they would need throughout their lives. A young boy watched intently as his father inspected their small herd of goats, noting which animals seemed healthy and which might need attention. A girl of perhaps 8 years carefully carried a water jar, concentrating intensely on each step to avoid spilling the precious contents. These were the moments that shaped character and built the foundation of a life lived in harmony with the natural world. There was no rushing, no frantic urgency. Each task received the attention it deserved, performed with a patience that modern minds might find difficult to comprehend. The grinding of grain was done thoroughly and carefully. The tending of animals was unhurried and observant. The preparation of the day's first meal proceeded with quiet deliberation. As the morning progressed, the village gradually filled with the sounds of productive activity. Artisans began their work, the rhythmic tapping of hammers and scraping of tools, creating a gentle percussion that blended with the natural sounds of the awakening day. Farmers prepared for their journey to the fields, gathering the implements they would need for whatever tasks the season demanded. The air itself seemed different in these early hours, cooler and fresher, carrying the promise of the day ahead. The harsh heat that would dominate the afternoon hours was still a distant threat, allowing for a peaceful transition from the restorative darkness of night to the productive energy of day. This was a time for gentle awakening, for quiet preparation, for the slow gathering of strength that would sustain the villagers through whatever challenges the day might bring. In the distance, the Nile flowed with its eternal patience, neither hurrying nor delaying, but maintaining the steady rhythm that had sustained this land since time immemorial. The villagers understood this rhythm in their bones, having been born into it and shaped by it from their earliest moments. They did not fight against time or try to impose their will upon it. Instead, they moved with it, allowing its natural flow to guide their actions and decisions. The morning meal was simple but nourishing, consisting of bread baked fresh from grain ground by the women of the household, perhaps accompanied by onions or garlic from the family garden, and weak beer that provided both sustenance and safety in a world where water quality could not always be trusted. Family members ate together, sharing not just food but conversation about the day ahead, the state of their crops, the health of their animals, and the small but important details that comprised their daily existence. As the sun reached higher into the sky, casting shorter shadows and bringing increased warmth, the time for leisurely awakening gradually gave way to the more focused activity of the working day. But even this transition was unhurried, allowing each person to move at their own pace while still contributing to the collective rhythm of village life. The women who had gone to fetch water began their return journey, their vessels now full and heavy. They walked carefully, supporting each other when the burden became difficult, sharing the load as they had always done. Their conversations continued as they walked, covering topics both practical and personal. Whose daughter was approaching marriageable age, which fields looked most promising this season, what remedies might help an elderly neighbour's persistent cough. Meanwhile, the men gathered to discuss the day's agricultural tasks. The season dictated much of what needed to be done, but there were always choices to be made, priorities to be established, resources to be allocated. These decisions were made collectively, with input from all who would be affected. There was no single authority imposing arbitrary commands, but rather a consensus-building process that honoured both practical necessity and human relationships. The children, having completed their morning responsibilities, began to engage in the kind of play that would prepare them for adult life. Boys practiced with miniature tools, imitating the actions they had observed their fathers performing. Girls played with dolls made from simple materials, rehearsing the domestic skills they would need as wives and mothers. But this was not merely imitation. It was creative exploration, as each child found their own way of approaching familiar tasks. As the morning advanced toward midday, the gentle awakening of the village was complete. Everyone was now engaged in the activities that would fill their day, moving with purpose, but without haste toward whatever goals the season and circumstances required. The transition from sleep to wakefulness, from rest to activity, from night to day, had been accomplished with the same natural grace that characterized everything in this ancient rhythm of life. The sun climbed steadily higher, its rays growing stronger and more insistent, reminding everyone that the easier hours of the morning were drawing to a close. Soon would come the heat of midday, when wise people sought shade and rest, conserving their energy for the cooler hours of late afternoon and evening. But for now, in these precious morning hours, there was time for unhurried activity, for careful attention to detail, for the kind of thorough work that built both material prosperity and spiritual satisfaction. The morning awakening in this ancient Egyptian village was thus not merely the beginning of another day, but a daily renewal of the fundamental rhythms that connected human life to the natural world, individual effort to collective welfare, and present moment to the eternal patterns that had sustained this civilization for millennia. The evening meal arrives as twilight settles over the village. painting the sky in soft shades of amber and deepening blue. Families gather around their modest fires, the day's labor finally complete. The meal is simple but nourishing. A bowl of thick barley porridge, perhaps enriched with a handful of dried beans or lentils saved from the last harvest. A piece of flatbread, dense and filling, baked on hot stones by the fire. If fortune has smiled upon them, there might be a small portion of dried fish or a bit of cheese made from goat's milk. Children sit close to their parents, their small hands wrapped around wooden bowls, steam rising from the warm food into the cooling air. The adults eat slowly, savoring each bite, knowing that tomorrow's meal depends on careful rationing of their stores. There is no waste here. Every grain of barley, every crumb of bread, every drop of broth is precious. The fire crackles softly as the family shares not just food, but the quiet communion of another day survived. Stories are told in hushed voices. Old tales passed down from grandparents about the time when the Nile ran especially high, or the year when the harvest was so abundant that even the poorest families had grain to spare. These stories serve as both entertainment and instruction, teaching the young ones about the rhythms of the river and the land. As the last light fades from the western horizon, the family prepares for sleep. The fire is banked carefully, embers preserved beneath a layer of ash to provide warmth through the night and make the morning's rekindling easier. Sleeping mats woven from reeds are unrolled near the dying fire. Thin woolen blankets, precious possessions in their own right, are shared among family members. The night sounds of the village begin to emerge. The gentle lowing of cattle in their enclosures, the soft murmur of voices from neighboring homes, the distant call of night birds along the river. These familiar sounds create a lullaby of security, a reminder that they are not alone in their struggle against the darkness. Sleep comes gradually, not the quick unconsciousness of the exhausted, but the slow drift of those who have found peace in the simple completion of another day. Dreams, when they come, are often of the coming season, of green shoots pushing through dark soil, of the river rising in its annual blessing, of granaries filled and families fed. In these quiet hours before dawn, when the village rests in darkness and the Nile flows silently toward the distant sea, there is a profound stillness. It is not the emptiness of despair, but the fullness of continuity. Tomorrow will bring the same tasks, the same challenges, the same small victories. But tonight there is rest. The stars wheel overhead in their eternal patterns, the same constellations that guided their ancestors and will guide their children. In this vast continuity, each life is both insignificant and precious, a single thread in the great tapestry of human existence along the Nile, woven with patience, endurance, and an unshakable faith in the rhythm of the seasons. As sleep finally claims the village, the ancient harmony continues. As evening shadows lengthen across the mud-brick houses, and the last light fades from the western hills, our village settles into the rhythms that have sustained it through countless generations. The day's work is done, the animals are fed, and families gather around their hearths, where small fires flicker against the gathering darkness. Tonight, as every night, there are quiet conversations about the harvest, about repairs needed before the rains come, about children who are learning to walk, and elders whose steps grow slower. These are the small, precious details of life that continue regardless of what distant pharaohs decree or what monuments rise in far-off cities. The women finish their spinning by firelight, their hands moving with the practiced ease of those who have known this work since childhood. Children drowse against their mothers' shoulders, lulled by the soft murmur of voices and the gentle crackle of burning reeds. The men check the animals one last time, ensuring the goats are secure and the chickens safely roosted. In houses throughout the village, oil lamps burn low, casting dancing shadows on walls that have sheltered the same families for generations. The scent of evening meals lingers in the air, simple fare made precious by shared hands and grateful hearts. Outside, the Nile flows, as it always has, carrying the life-giving waters that make this existence possible. As people prepare for sleep, there's a sense of completion that comes not from grand achievements, but from daily tasks, faithfully performed. The fields have been tended. The bread has been baked. The sick have been cared for. Children have been taught the skills they'll need. Stories have been shared that connect them to those who came before and those who will come after. This is how civilizations truly endure, not through the monuments of kings, but through the patient, persistent work of ordinary people who understand that life is sustained one day at a time, one season at a time, one generation at a time. In their quiet dedication to the rhythms of planting and harvest, of birth and death, of work and rest, they create something more lasting than any pyramid. The village sleeps now, but it will wake tomorrow to begin again the ancient work of living. And in that continuity, in that faithful tending of the essential tasks of human existence, lies a wisdom deeper than any royal decree and more enduring than any golden tomb. In the gentle darkness, where the only sounds are the whisper of wind through the date palms and the distant call of night birds along the river, the true heart of ancient Egypt beats on, steady and strong, carrying its people forward into whatever tomorrow may bring.